Hi, everyone. I'm Ophelia Jacobson with Campus Reform, and we've got another great interview lined up for you today. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and to give this video a like if you want to see more content like this from Campus Reform. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Peter Wood, President of the National Association of Scholars and author of the new book, 1620, A Critical Response to the 1619 Project. He joins me today to talk about his new book and its message. Mr. Wood, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview.
I'm delighted to be here.
So let's go ahead and get started. Tell us a little bit about your book and why you decided to write it.
Well, the book is, as the subtitle suggests, a response to the New York Times' 1619 Project. It was born the day after the New York Times first published its 1619 Project as a Sunday magazine in mid-August of 2019. I read it that morning. I came into work the next day, told my staff, we really can't let this stand. We need to respond. One of my staff members, let's call our response the 1620 Project. Why 1620? Well, 1620 was when the Mayflower landed in Massachusetts, and in November of that year, 400 years ago this month, the crew, the Pilgrim passengers and their secular counterparts that the Pilgrims called the strangers, came together and signed what we now call the Mayflower Compact. Mayflower Compact is a declaration of a kind of self-government, the very first one in American history. Why that's important is that the New York Times' 1619 Project declares that our history really began in August of 1619, when a pirate ship brought brought slaves to Jamestown, Virginia. The pirates were very hungry and they traded their slaves for food. The people in Jamestown did not recognize slavery. They treated the African Americans, some 20 people, as indentured servants. They put them to work, and in a few years, like every other indentured servant, they were set free. Somehow, according to the Times, that's the model by which racial oppression, the tyranny of slavery, got into American life and has been here ever since. So I was looking for a succinct way to say, that's not really where we began. It may be historically interesting, it's a kind of footnote to American history, but it's not our origin story. The United States, of course, came into existence in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. I'm not trying to preempt that important event, but many things happened before the Declaration of Independence. And if we go back over the long sweep of history, none is more important than that Mayflower Compact.
So at the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform, we've been covering the 1619 Project from the perspective of how it's now becoming the norm on many college campuses and in curriculums as well. What do you think is the danger in teaching this entire generation of Americans this false history?
Oh, there are multiple dangers, but probably the most important is that the 1619 Project teaches a kind of self-hatred, self-loathing. It looks back to our history as a tissue of oppression, of racism from the get-go, and from the denial of rights and opportunities to people of African American or African heritage. And it preaches to everybody else that you're responsible for all the terrible things that happen to the African American community. That is a really impossible way to view our country. It leaves out all of our important achievements, or takes those achievements and turns them upside down and makes them into atrocities. To have a nation, you need people who love the nation, and to love the nation, you need to know its real history. That doesn't require eradicating the bad things that happened. Those should be taught as well. They should not be made out as though that's all that ever really mattered.
So what do you think is the overall goal of the 1619 Project? Is it to destroy the very foundations of this country?
Well, it is that. I think you can find multiple goals here. One of the goals was to drive President Trump out of office. We know that because in the summer of 2019, the editors of the New York Times were deeply disappointed with the outcome of the Mueller investigation, and they sat around and discussed what else they could do to undermine the Trump presidency. And they came up with this idea. So we know about that from participants in that conversation. We know that the 1619 Project had its origins in a desire to stir up racial resentment and depict President Trump as an evil man. Of course, that wasn't all there was to it. The principal author of the 1619 Project, a woman named Nicole Hannah-Jones, had been harboring for years a desire to elevate the story of Black oppression as the central part of our history. So yes, there is a desire to tear down the country. And if we have to tear down the country to get rid of President Trump, the New York Times decided that's good enough for us. In any case, the results of the 1619 Project have been every bit as dire as Nicole Hannah-Jones could have hoped for. When the riots broke out following the death of George Floyd in police custody, she proudly declared that these riots were the 1619 riots. So she takes responsibility for stirring up the kind of enmity that has now resulted in billions of dollars of damage and many lives lost.
So to Americans who have heard so much about the 1619 Project over the last few months, or even just hearing negative things about our country's history, what are a few things or facts that you found from your research that can prove that America is in fact a noble country?
Well, I would say we look to the American founding, which was founded on the highest principles known in Western history, maybe in human history, when we decided that all men are created equal, and that we would try to create a government based on that principle. It was not an easy thing to do. The inequalities of that age, which included slavery, stood in the way, but we set for ourselves aspirations. The aspirations of our Declaration of Independence, I think, overcome a lot of the faults and flaws in the creation of our country. But we also went on to realize some of those claims. We ended the slave trade about 25 years after the Declaration of Independence, at least the legal slave trade. We then went on to fight a horrible civil war in order to take down the institution of slavery altogether. And with the passage of the 14th Amendment, out it went. We've had the civil rights movement, which was another great struggle to overcome the residue of the disenfranchisement from the Jim Crow era, and that too was successful. There's a lot we can look back on with pride as to the achievements of just this search for racial justice in our history. But there are immense achievements in other ways too. We became the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. That was by our industry, by our individualism, by our ability to invent and to turn those inventions into prosperity for all. We are a nation that achieved a higher level of equality among people who were originally unequal. We welcomed into this country many millions of immigrants and assimilated them to a vision of what it means to be a free and equal people. So that's a history that needs to be told. I fear it's a history that is not being told well, given the readiness by which our schools and colleges have adopted this Hate America First agenda in its place.
So what would you say is the best way to convince Americans who may see racial problems in this country that the way forward is to turn to our country's values for a solution instead of tearing them down?
I would say that Americans need to at least know what actually happened in our history. The facts do matter, and it's important not to let mythology get in the way. It's easy to give vent to frustration and to become embittered if things don't go your way, but a broader knowledge of history and the achievements along the way tells a very different story. I think we need to look to the successes of all our people and recognize that this is a nation that has made those opportunities available as none other has. We call that American exceptionalism, and I think teaching American exceptionalism is probably the best overall counterpoint to what the 1619 Project is trying to put forward.
Well, thank you so much again for taking the time to do this interview. We encourage our viewers to buy the book when it comes out on Amazon on November 17th. I know I'll be looking forward to picking up a copy myself. And again, Mr. Wood, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.